Okay, I think looks like I got a critical mass here, so I'll get started here. And hopefully, if you want to follow along, the links for both the slides and this paper here are on Slack. And so I'm just kind of doing this for it was sort of a spontaneous idea talking with a number of folks after came back from the break. There is a lot of goals to write papers in the coming months, and so I thought this would be a good opportunity to share both particularly this resource, this paper that I'm going to be basing a lot of the talk on, and then a few of my personal sort of style and recommendations for paper writing, and it's it's often a very daunting process, and there may be some of you out there who like writing. There are, I know, a lot of researchers who writing is not something they're going to look forward to, and I think what I really like about this paper that I'll and the points that I'll go through is I think a lot of what it does is helps to focus and constrain the writing process, as well as a lot of tips for effective communication. All right, so let me bring up this, and then please feel free to interrupt me or stick questions in the chat, and we can have some discussion as we go along or at the end. So let's see, get this up here. All right, let me know if you can't see this for whatever reason. So there we go here. Yeah, so I'm basing this off of this article that I can't remember how I came across, but really, and when I read it, I was like, it just, and I probably read it like 5 years ago, and it just really resonated with me, a few of the points. And so I'm going to go through here what you'll see, my quote marks here at the top are things I've taken from that paper, and then a few of my sort of comments here below. So starting off, maybe this should be obvious, but not always so. What is the goal of good scientific writing? And the goal is to really make your reader's job as easy as possible. Okay, so you can do great science, great experiments, great results. If somebody can't pick up that work and read it and access it and understand it, it's going to have a harder time making an impact on scientific knowledge, on the research in the field. And so of course the writing has to, or the paper has to, include the scientific results, but what makes good scientific writing is making your reader's job more easy, and so clarity of writing, concise, which is something that I think I certainly often struggle with, keeping things to the point, and we all can probably write and talk more and more, but you sort of have to be concise to engage readers. Make things easy to follow. Let's make the reader's job as easy as possible. And the final point that I'll sort of reiterate throughout is that there's not a one right way to do this. You'll see lots of examples of good scientific writing in different ways, but it does require practice and in itself. So I'll sort of follow this outline, which is from the paper, the elements of scientific style, elements of the paper itself, and then a little of my own addition here on the writing, submission, and review process at the end. Okay, so elements of the style, the words, and really the one of the main points made by in the Plaxo paper is that jargon is one of the greatest enemies of clear scientific writing. And, you know, this may be counterintuitive to what you see in a lot of scientific writing, because we love using jargon. We love using acronyms and abbreviations. There's, you know, I think there's some underlying feeling like, oh, we sound, you know, smart, or we feel like we we're sort of in the know in a field if we can use a lot of the jargon of the field. You know, there is a balance. I mean, there's certainly value to using some, you know, common acronyms and common terms, but it needs to be, I guess, what do I want to say? Tempered, you know, and so I think it does require some thought to you know, think carefully if you want to invent a new acronym, or you want to put in a new word or phrase, that is this really helping? Are you gonna, is this a valuable way to communicate the concepts? And, you know, often it's going to be easier for the reader if you write something out. For example, think if you've read papers and you get, maybe you skip part of the methods, you jump into the results or something, and they're talking about some term, and you're like, well, what does this mean? Because it's a new jargon from that paper. And so you spend a few minutes searching or going back up through the rest of the paper, trying to figure out what they mean by that term. And, you know, it makes the reader's job harder in that way. But you know, it can be useful to me to make abbreviations. I point out a couple, you know, examples from my experience here at the bottom. Like, so if we want to do a more descriptive, like a variable here, like KPL for our pyruvate to lactate conversion to rate, as opposed to something like K12, which would be is not very descriptive. So at least having the P and the L, you know, gives you some idea of, well, what is this abbreviation representing. Another thing that point they make in the paper that I've seen is not to use sort of arbitrary names for example, experiment A or group 1, and use, you know, descriptive names. So the tumor progression experiment, or the relapsing remitting, you know, group, and you know, and then use these descriptive names throughout, so that somebody can jump into your paper, read a figure caption, read a sentence here and there, and actually like start to be engaged from the get-go. So again, I think this is actually starting off with kind of a hard one there, a jargon, and that's something I think you can also work on in revision a lot. This is another, you know, sort of common trap it can be a little harder to identify when you're writing, I find, so Kevin Plaxo quote, "A well-written sentence usually leads with the action." So this is, you know, you could say this is to generally try to use like the active voice as opposed to the passive voice. And so again, the verb in active voice is what actually happened. So we implemented the algorithm. Implemented is the action of what happened, as opposed to the algorithm was implemented would be the passive voice, which is very common. You find out a whole lot in scientific writing. And I think there's this, you know, fear of using like we or I, which I think, in my opinion, is completely fine to use, because this is your work. You know, we did this, the team, or whoever, you did this. work, I think it makes to me, it makes the writing and the reading also more personal, but also more engaging. And then so if we progress words, sentences, and into paragraphs, the guidance from the paper is, first sentence of each paragraph should tell the reader what you expect them to get out of the paragraph that follows, which makes their job of following it far easier. And so I think this is a really good a goal to have in mind, is that when somebody is starting to read a paragraph, and this can make your job as a writer, I think, easier, is to think about, okay, I'm going to add something in here. I need my topic sentence, my first sentence of that paragraph, to just set out what I'm going to say. And just going through that little exercise of writing that topic sentence, I think makes your job as a writer actually easier too. And then you can say, oh yeah, okay, I've distilled the material that I've got into this concept, and then as you're going back and revising or maybe adding things, you can go back and look at that paragraph and say, oh, maybe something doesn't fit there. Yeah, I think this is a very, very simple rule, but a very effective one. And then this is more of a gray area. A paragraph should discuss only a single idea. I will say something I'm very comfortable with stylistically is to actually do a number of, do many sort of short paragraphs if there really are a very distinct, diverse ideas. Yeah, something you can think about as you're, and you can think about it in the context of having this first sentence of the paragraph to define what you're going to say in the paragraph. I want to just take a quick break right there. Does anybody have any questions on this? Is the scientific style guidance here? Okay. Yeah, I think when I was putting this together, the part that sort of struck me the most to any sort of think was the jargon part of this piece, and again, I see both sides. I think there is value to some amount of jargon in terms of does make it easy to very quickly communicate a certain, for example, a certain pulse sequence by using the defined acronym for it. But it is worth examining, the jargon that we're using and saying, is it necessary? Okay. Oh, I see a question here from Valentina. Do you think this? I think this applies to papers and grants equally. Let's see. In terms of the scientific style, I think let's see. So words, yes, I think this definitely applies. And generally your job as a grant writer is to make the reviewers, good grant writing makes makes the reader's job as easy as possible. Right, so they can clearly follow your ideas. They're not having to jump around the proposal. And so, these guidance on words and jargon, I think can make the grant readable much very clearly as well. Sentences, yeah, probably helps there too. And I actually, I really think so for grants, this paragraph style of either the first sentence of a paragraph kind of leading into what's going to be discussed there is maybe even more important in my experience in the grant context. And I think I pay attention to more there. Yep.
This is Kirthi. I think I find it hard, I think in papers to put in first. I don't think I ever use I or we. I mean, that seems a little bit strange. Do you read like scientific papers that use that first, or you know what I mean? Like I or we, like in the paper?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually write papers with
okay, sorry.
pronouns too. Yeah. Yeah, it's not as common, but if you don't do that, it leads to a lot more of the passive voice. And you know, it's, I mean, sometimes you want to be distinguishing. I use it a lot, certainly in the discussion sections of where to make it clear, you know, maybe the division of what I think the data is saying and what am I saying, right? So I think, you know, comment on trends or papers, trends or sort of things that are, you know, clear in the results, or you know, pointing out features of the data. Then I would probably not use those I, we pronouns. But then if I'm shifting to some sort of interpretation of, I might use, and especially in the discussion where it might be more speculative. Yeah, thanks for the questions.
Hey, Peter, sorry, can I ask a question? It's Jess.
Yeah, Jess, what's up?
So I like this idea the paragraph should discuss only a single idea, and it kind of got me thinking about how you might kind of map that out as you're writing a paper, and maybe you'll go into this later, but do you have a strategy for how you kind of start that process? Like, do you think about kind of the individual paragraphs from the get-go? Just kind of thinking about how you'd sit down and do it.
I personally probably at the first pass, I wouldn't quite get to the individual paragraph level. Make it to the level of maybe what might be a small section or set of a few paragraphs to start with. And I think usually the paragraph level comes out and I'm sort of actively writing the paper. But you could potentially include that in sort of an outlining stage too, of like, okay, I need, say you have results, I need a paragraph that discusses, you know, result number one from the, you know, the data, or a paragraph that describes, you know, another point I want to make with the data. And then, you know, I need, for figure 2, I need 3 paragraphs because I'm going to talk about these 3 aspects. Or maybe you just need, you know, 1 paragraph for that figure. You certainly could do that.
Yeah. Thanks.
But I would definitely encourage, you know, some level of detail of outlining to start. Okay, so I'll move into the elements of the scientific paper and go through basically every section you might see in papers, at least in the imaging fields. The title. So a couple pieces of guidance are interesting, I think, from this paper. The title should headline the main result described in the paper, and not the main effort. So another way of saying that is not what you the title doesn't say just what you did, but it says what did you accomplish? What did you find? So try to think of sort of an example of fresh in my mind. We could say application of hyperpolarized MRI to renal cell carcinoma. That's what we were trying to do, was apply it. Probably the second one was a title I would be comfortable with, and I think is a stronger one. Hyperpolarized MRI is feasible for studying renal cell carcinoma. So, that's actually some result, and maybe this is as far as the paper got as possible, right? You just established like a feasibility. And we don't have a big result of the third title, hyperpolarized MRI measures aggressiveness in renal cell carcinoma. If the results support it, that would be a much stronger title. But I think the middle one would be, of course, it has to be concordant with and with the results too. And I think here there's maybe a little difference in that, some of the work, our work may be driven by creating a method, a technology, in which case the results and the effort are kind of different. They are the same. Sorry, the method and the result are the same, and so there's not sort of this main result, like maybe an experimental result might not be there. It might be more just the technique. But then, and being descriptive, being reasonably specific, and the last point there from the paper, I try to use as broad a title as possible as I can reasonably get away with. I think this is an interesting thing to consider. There'll probably be a lot of papers where you have to be specific, because that's where the contribution of the paper is sort of, like in the example here, you couldn't just say hyperpolarized MRI for studying cancer, because that's, that's already been kind of established. We need to narrow it down to being, renal cell carcinoma. It could be a follow-up study, would be clear cell renal cell carcinoma. In these examples, I didn't specify the subtype of the cancer that would be studied, but because being a little bit, more broad, and you have to balance here. So these factors, as well as definitely don't overstate your results in the title. I think in academics, overstating things is frowned upon, at least in my experience. And workshop title. I mean, I think titles always often take a little bit of iteration to settle on. Okay, then you have the introduction. And the introduction has precisely one purpose: to convince your readers that they should read your paper. And the Plaxo outlines a sort of a very clear structure, and I think this is, especially if you have a little bit of writer's block or not sure where to start with this would be a great place to start. Is that take this sort of 3-paragraph structure of, and it's an inverted pyramid. You start with the broadest thing but still relevant. You're not going to. So in this example, broadening it out at the most point to talk about the impact of renal cell carcinomas, and then narrowing that pyramid down and saying, well, what's the important open question that the work addresses sort of within this bigger area. And this can be where a bit of the literature review that's very common in introductions might be, assessing, well, here's what has been done, here's where the holes are, or the unmet needs in the prior work, and then coming down to the final paragraph of the introduction that it will say, might start something like in this paper, or we did it's just an example, we applied hyperpolarized MRI to renal cell carcinomas, and often this can be just a sort of a quick description of what's going to happen, but typically you're not going to give away the conclusion at this point. You're just going to introduce convince the reader that you've got a good open question in an important area that you've identified, and then give them a little preview for the effort part, what you did. I will say I don't think necessarily need to stay to the 3-paragraph structure, but I think that can be a really good framework if you're looking for a place to start. Then I added something here that's not in that paper, a theory section, and because you will, I'm sure you come across some papers that will have a theory section. There is a subset of work, I think, in imaging that could deserve a theory section. This should be, if you have some really new theoretical framework that you need to introduce. In general, if it's a framework, if you're using theory that's published or established, generally I would suggest referencing that theory. Maybe if it's very important, you could kind of rewrite some of the key results in the you may not, in general, you may or may not be the theory section, and I guess think about it from the way I think about it is, could I put a reference here? Could somebody go to a textbook, or could I put a reference in here that would get somebody sort of up to speed to read the rest of the paper? Or are the references that are out there, or even if it's established, if the references out there are not good, or I need to introduce a little bit of new notation that I think is going to more clearly support the paper, then yeah, maybe I would include that in a theory, or possibly in the methods section. Could be there. And then you're definitely going to have a methods section papers. What goes in the methods section? Every detail necessary were someone to attempt to reproduce your work, and then some. So maybe I'll start with the last point here. Every detail necessary may be a bit cumbersome, maybe a bit too much for the main text, but fortunately you have the option of using supplemental or supporting information. And if there are things that are really like mechanistic details that you want to include, but maybe because of paper page limits or word limits, or just for the flow even of the paper, you don't want to have in the actual methods section, by all means make liberal use of the supplemental and supporting information. I view that section as being there for the person who's reading your paper, who's like, okay, I want to do this exact same experiment, or I want to do some direct building off the experiment or the technique that you've done, and so it's your obligation to write it in enough detail to support that reader. The importance of methods is variable. If it's a methods driven, so technique driven research, like some of the projects I'm involved with, then the methods section can be extremely important to outline, what algorithm was created, what pulse sequence was implemented, something like that. If the methods section is more of a means to the, say, a set of experimental results, then you know, you don't need to have maybe as much emphasis on methods section. So it varies a little bit by the type of work. The other point I think was interesting from from the Plaxo paper was this top point can include some limited discussion. So compare with prior, experiments, and that's like yeah, you're allowed a little bit of flexibility here, a little bit of commentary to provide a little bit of extra insight into, maybe why you did something in a certain way, or if a certain value, how you chose a certain set of parameters, or if you think, you could even just comment a little bit on that choice, or often, sometimes we're limited in the methods we can do by resources, right? And I think it's very legitimate to comment on that limitation in the methods section. Half the data was acquired on one scanner, half the data was acquired on the other scanner because that's what we had, that's what we could do, would be quite reasonable to have in your methods. And I sort of put things in the order of like one of my journals, MRM, which would have a methods after introduction and or theory sections, and then you would get into the results. So from Plaxo, the results section should typically start with a paragraph describing your approach in broad terms, as most of your readers will initially skip over the methods section and jump right into the meat. So I actually generally have not done this in papers that I've written, although probably maybe because a number of these have a methods section that if somebody didn't read it, they would be lost in the results section. But maybe that's a sort of a interesting way to look at your paper once you've written it, is to imagine yourself as the reader that maybe jumps right into your results, right? Maybe they don't read the rest of anything before that, and or they jump right into your figures, as I mentioned later, and can they latch on to the key ideas? Can they start to actually make sense of the results if the reader does in fact do that, or is the writing going to be such that it's going to require them to be jumping back to other parts of the paper? And then this is I want to spend a second on the second point here, make sure to point this out. It is generally acceptable to include some discussion in the results section. So I will say this is, I've definitely seen both sides to this opinion here. There are some people who write with results are just like, there is nothing more there than results, than anything that can be reasonably extrapolated from the data, from the results, which leads to really uninteresting to read papers, and often things that are very disjointed. You have these like paragraphs in the results of, we observed 10% of this, 20% of this, 20% of this. In the next experiment, we observed blah, blah, blah. Or they're very just, again, very, very factual, of course, but they are just sticking to a very limited amount of what is provided there. And I really like to write with a little bit of discussion in the results. So something, a simple example might be, we observed X, and then discussion could be, well, this, is in agreement with our expectation based on paper Y, or just a little bit of context for the results, and can include like a little bit of speculation, and ultimately you are gonna most work has some amount of jumps in there. You're trying to connect different pieces, and so starting to do that for the reader in the results I think can really help with the readability of a paper. Now this is a case where you could, you can distinguish what is speculation from what is the data by, use of words, like keywords, like say we believe, we expect, we speculate. But thinking of it, and I think what this does is you have to sort of think of it as telling a story, having a narrative a little bit, that somebody could read through and get a clear idea of what you're trying to say with the results. So again, I think some people probably have issue with this statement, but my personal style is I strongly agree with it. The discussion is kind of fun. The discussion allows you to reiterate your point bluntly and concisely, and thus provides an additional forum in which to get your point across. It is also the only place you are allowed to speculate widely and perhaps wildly on the implications of your work. Okay, so when I'm writing a discussion, and the discussion is where papers can often get a little bit unwieldy, and so they kind of can become a catch-all for everything that didn't fit somewhere else. So you do want to think of a little bit of a structure here to keep things concise and engaging, but often starting with some reiteration of the key results. So repeating what you maybe have just said, or sort of summarizing what you've just said in the results section, maybe thinking back to the introduction and what is the bigger context of these results that you've just shown. Then I usually have in here some detailed comparisons to prior work. If that is not a part of the results, it's usually a part of the discussion. Do values that you measure matched others? How does this compare to prior literature? Is often a hard thing to do, but an important thing to do in a paper. I will usually have a section that states the limitations of the work, right? What is, what can be expected to interpret from it, but doing so succinctly. So you probably, when you're writing a paper, too much. Everything and anything that could go wrong, or every little detail limitation. You have to, usually you can't put everything in there. You got to think, like, what are really the key limitations, right? What are, and you have to do a little bit of interpretation here and think, okay, does maybe one limitation really matters right now, and maybe another one, only matters if the work progresses from animal studies to human studies. So, maybe that's, for example, that might not be important in the context of this work. So I would just say avoid like ballooning kind of limitation sections, and as a reader's point of view, sometimes can just make the readers a little depressed or a little less enthusiastic about the work. And of course, every work has limitations. That's part of science, and everyone understands that. And so, and I think giving your work a fair presentation and showing what are the key limitations is good science. And then sort of what can be, I think, is the fun part, is adding in speculations of maybe you have some idea about what the what the results mean in some bigger sense, right? That maybe the wild speculation part, and you can make little arguments about why you think that, and have some fun with that. But you good to use these sort of identifiers to say that, look, these are not things that are following directly from the data that we're showing. These are in fact speculations. And another specific point, I typically don't suggest including like what are the next studies, the future studies. I mean, I know this is sort of a common practice. And my reasoning for that is that, it's again, it is that it's inherent in research, is that there's limitations and there's always a future study, a future work, something you could do better next time, or given this or that. And I think this is another piece where I'm fine to include this in papers, but it can also sort of explode into something that I think detracts from what you're really trying to show and tell the readers the current paper, and that are the current results. There may be cases where this is important if you want to get readers excited about, like, hey, here's our results in this group of renal cell carcinoma patients, and well, we are already starting to study this group of patients, or we're collecting this new data, so stay tuned. You could have something that's sort of leading the readers, getting them excited about the future work, but sort of just more blanket or broad speculations of future work, I tend to shy away from. Okay, 4:45, I think we'll make it here. Figures and figure captions. So, good set of figures greatly enhances the paper. Almost always worth a lot of effort, and we're, at least personally, I'm a very visual person, so figures are often what give me the most impact of when I'm reading a paper, and we're imaging scientists, so images, of course, speak to many of us. And the figures are at their strongest when the reader can take in the story by just looking at the figures. So you can do this with a couple of things. You can add descriptive labels directly onto the figure. I'll show an example in the next slide. Something where the person can look at just look at the figure itself and get almost the whole story without having to look to the caption, which is a common, I think, a common pitfall that is often, and it's maybe a little bit less work to create the figure that just has A, B, C, D, on it, and doesn't really elaborate as much. And make sure all elements of the figure are very readable, clear font sizes, distinct choices of colors, lines, you sort of a little bit of style that needs to be there. And I'm going to tip over this figure 1 point for just a sec. Also, I believe that the reader should be able to ascertain the entire story just by reading the figure captions. So this is sort of the flip of that too, is that the caption should not just be purely sort of factual, repeating what is shown in the figure itself, but you providing a little bit of context, right? Of this is the experiment designed to, here are the results of our experiment that was designed for this purpose. Not just this is experiment A or something. So adding a little bit more story to it. You can add a little bit of the interpretation. It might be repetitive, what's in the results section. I think that is perfectly okay to basically have the same things in the captions and in the results text. Because then making the reader's job as easy as possible. They can go to your figures, they can look at the figure and the caption, and really get, you can use that as a tool to make a reader quickly get the point and what you want to merely emphasize for the paper. And for the figure caption, I thought this was a good tip of the first sentence of the figure caption can affect be almost a title or a title sentence for the figure. And then jumping back, this is something that I've seen a lot of people use very effectively, to almost always have a figure 1 that really explains in some sort of cartoon, chart, or diagram what the overall goal of the paper might be. I think especially in situations where maybe the experimental design or the method may be sort of non-standard, you might want to outline, your treatment and your control group, and well, you're going to show data at different time points X, Y, Z. You can throw in maybe a sample image or something, or if you have a method, maybe illustrating the algorithm or the approach, can be extremely helpful, quickly used to orient the readers. And then this is something that you often, if you may be reusing in presentations, because often this type of figure is the type of thing you want to show somebody in a presentation when you're using less words and more visual aids to explain what your study was. So I kind of like this approach of figure 1 being the overall goal of the paper. Again, I don't think it always fits, but there's a lot of cases where it could. And so this is an example from the paper that I sent around, where the left is sort of the quote unquote bad example here, and the right is the good example. And a couple of the key points, instead of, he's gone from an A, B, C, D of the subplots to actually labeling them with a descriptive title for the subplots. So, you can go directly to, you can just look at the figure and you don't have to be jumping into the caption as much. I haven't done this, but I see that they labeled the different lines instead of with the legend, with the label like next to the lines. I've never done that, but maybe that can work well. And I think the other thing is like on the y-axis of these plots, they added a little bit of context to what the units are. And so I think this is a good example. And a simple thing you can do, again, is this first thing I pointed out. You can still use A, B, C, D, but have a little, if you have subfigures or, arrays of images, that there's a label on the figure itself of what each of these things is. So the reader is not going from figure to caption to figure to caption to try and, don't make them, you're making them do hard work of like, okay, first row was what again? Is that, and really trying to sort out maybe all the information that you want to convey. So you may, depending on your tendencies, you may want to try to over annotate on the figure. Oops. And then the caption here is, I'll leave it to you to sort of read it, but that's an example of a caption that tells the story of the figure, not just, strictly it talks about what is there, but adds a little bit more context, a little bit more description to what's in the figure. And in my opinion, this is more than acceptable. This is a nice way to make better use of the figure captions. This is another place to tell your story. And then last, but sort of not least, the abstract, the single most important element in a paper, right? No pressure. And the other thing is most of us tend to write this at the very end. So I'll say when I'm reviewing papers, often the abstract is feels like an afterthought because probably it was the last thing that was written and less time has been spent on it. But this is what a lot of people will only read the abstract. And I like that there's a little guidance here of if you're having trouble writing an abstract, I think something like this can be a really helpful way to start, is to look at this type of structure that was outlined in the Plaxo paper. And you don't have to really think about, well, how should this, follow this sort of formula for how to structure this, and you'll be able to write a really, strong abstract. And then as you practice, this will be something that maybe you can vary on this theme a little bit, or you won't have to look back at sort of what the structure should be of the abstract. But I would consider, if you're, again, if you're having trouble writing the abstract or writing one for the first or 10th time, whatever, you can come back to this kind of structure just to help yourself out with the writing process. And then I added a little bit here, subsections. I personally advocate for the liberal use of subsections within a paper. So taking the methods, breaking it up into maybe the different parts. It might be the experimental setup, the pull sequence used, the data analysis, and sometimes there can be things like the example at the bottom. Maybe I have two types of experiments: phantom experiments and rat experiments. And so I might use a parallel subsection structure of, okay, methods. Here's the method for phantoms. Here's the method for rats. In the results, I would use the same the same word choice exactly. Here's the results for the phantoms. Here's the results for the rats. And that makes also the reader's job easier to give this like parallel structure. And in general, taking especially if it becomes kind of a lengthy section, methods is maybe more common, but you can also, I think, do it in the results of breaking it up into smaller pieces, label the subsections of what you're going to talk about for the next several paragraphs. I think it's something that makes your reader's job easier. And this will depend a little bit on the length. If you have a shorter paper, or you sort of have everything is kind of under one theme, then maybe this doesn't make sense. But especially if you're trying to bring together some different types of data, different types of experiments, I think this can be really helpful. So, and I know we're getting close to 5. I'm going to keep going. I'd like to continue. As you can see, I've got about 7 more slides here. I'm going to keep going past 5. Won't be offended if anybody drops off. And this will be recorded. And you have the slides. Okay, the tense. I generally use the past tense. Plaxo did advocate for a present tense of the results based on what he says. I believe most observations reported in the literature are better described in the present tense because, assuming your experiments are reproducible, the observation remains true even after the experiment was performed. Sort of a minor point. References. Pick a reference manager before going into a paper and put your references there. I personally use Zotero, but Mendeley, EndNote, also great options. And there's a way to export data in between them. And you can look at other papers and get an idea of like how many references. Typically probably in the range of 30. It might be a typical for a paper. You don't need to cover every single piece of the literature, especially if you're in a crowded field that has a lot of work, say like MRI, image reconstruction, compressed sensing or something. There's going to be tons and tons of papers out there. So you maybe distill it down to maybe review articles or a couple of the most relevant techniques. Another strategy that I've used to appease potential readers and reviewers is in the hyperpolarized field. There's a limited number of research groups in any given topic area. So I'll try to like have one reference from each of the research groups, maybe the latest one or their most significant one from each research group that I will include in the paper to kind of acknowledge, their contributions to that research area. You know, the other thing you can do as you're including software or data sharing is you can get a DOI. If you're not familiar, that's a digital object identifier for your code. And there's a great service, Zenodo. If you haven't been exposed to it, it would definitely take a look if you want to reference software or data. And what they will do is they will, I think it's sponsored by CERN or has some backing of European science agencies, I think. And they will actually archive, they'll take a snapshot of your code or your data. They'll, you know, sort of try to archive it in perpetuity and then have this DOI that you can reference there. Valentina says, how much do you reference yourself? A decent amount, probably. Yeah, you know, I think with that, I think it's kind of accepted that everybody does it a bit. You know, I think you have to make sure you're being fair to other people in the field, at least, you know, including some references to other work that's going on. If you're just like totally self-referencing, you know, then you're going to get, people are reading it are going to get bad vibes, and you're going to lose some respect. So, but you know, everybody understands everybody references themselves. That's the work you know the best, so you're more likely to reference it. And you want to get people looking at your, you know, if you're building off prior work, you want to get people looking back at your past paper if it's really relevant. Okay, and so there are a couple of questions about like the writing process, and this is my sort of style and recommendations. Definitely would start with an outline, and sometimes even I'll start off with figures or drafting figures, because those are often the focal point of the results and even the methods, if you have a methods figure. And so you can kind of think of, well, what do I need to show in the figure? Therefore, what do I need to have in the text? But yeah, worth including, you know, outlining things a bit first, and it just takes takes what is a big process and a big effort and helps you kind of divide it up into reasonable points. If you're working very closely with co-authors, that makes it a lot easier for you to say, you know, you have the outline, say, okay, co-author A, I need you to look at this section, or I need you to write something in this section for me. And it's going to make working with others easier as well, as opposed to sending them some more onerous document that's going to take extra time for them to sort out. And again, I often start with figures and work a lot on the figures before even getting to the text. And then with the text, guidance I got a long time ago that I still use is filling in the methods usually first, because that should be pretty straightforward to write. You did what you did. You can't really change that too much by the time maybe you'll add a little bit if you're continuing to work on the project, but the methods are sort of the methods. So you can get the writing kind of going. You can feel good about, okay, I filled out a little chunk of the paper now, kind of get a little bit of confidence to go into writing the rest of the paper. Then usually the results, because if the results aren't there, you know, then every other section is meaningless. So you need to have a sort of a solid results. And then in the process, sometimes I'll be jotting ideas in the other sections. Like I might write out the topic sentence, or like just a note of like, here's some of my points for the discussion, or here's some of my points for the introduction, as I'm filling in the methods and results section. And then here, one of my, this phrase, perfection is the enemy of good. You're inevitably going to need to revise, whether it's from your co-authors or whether it's from the reviewers. You know, so you need to remember that, and that it's gonna be disappointing if you spend all this time perfecting some part of paper, and you know, you hand it to somebody else, or you get the review and they're like, you know, well, I think you need to change this, and that can be deflating. And so I think it's really good to take the bottom point there is to take an outline or a very rough draft, maybe even your figures, and send it to, just maybe just one or maybe two of like people you feel like you can share that with, and will give you sort of the right feedback. And at that early stage, and maybe with the expectation they're not going to read every, give you exact edits on the text, but just say, maybe give you sort of a thumbs up of great, good direction to go. Maybe, a big picture like, hey, you need another figure or something. And usually start with that, maybe of just one or two people that you really do a lot of the writing with. And then usually the way I do is send it out to all the authors much more towards the very end of the process. Again, this is going to depend a little bit on your project and the paper. But once you get to the point of sending to, especially if it's a larger author list, you want to have something that's pretty, that certainly is complete and is pretty well polished already. And then I should mention on that first point, I sort of talked about this, but it's often a tendency for us to just get sort of text edits, track changes in Word or something, which are, definitely very helpful. But part of the learning process can be, especially if there are comments, is to maybe have initiate a dialogue with people that give you comments and say, well, why do you think I should do this here? And I think that can help you learn from, your co-authors as to from their writing experience and their writing style. And again, this does take a little bit of extra work typically, because often what you're going to get is you email things out and you'll get emails back with comments. But especially when you're kind of starting off in scientific writing, I think it can be a good process to go through. And then the other part here is sort of practical, find an environment that works for you to write in. I find that's not the same as the rest of my work environment necessarily. And for me, it's hard for me to write with interruptions and with small amounts of time. So I need to find ways to carve out longer amounts of time and without distraction. And the other thing is, I think papers, they can, if you've been working on them for a long time, they can become just mentally exhausting and overwhelming. And if you have the opportunity, I think it's okay to put the paper writing aside for maybe even if it's just a couple days, but maybe a week, and transition to another project. Kind of let your give it a little breathing room, and then I think you can come back to things with a fresh perspective sometimes that can get lost when you really get into the weeds of a paper. And you can get this naturally by, if you have something and you send it off to your co-authors, and you can say, okay, I can take a little mental break from this while they read it, and then I'm going to have to get back into it when I get their comments and go through those. But I can sort of, because it's not, if you're feeling overwhelmed by a paper, if you're feeling frustrated by writing a paper, intimidated, these are all very normal feelings to have. It's probably more rare the person who can, just keep writing all the time and be super excited and motivated by it. And find your own style too. I'm giving you pointers here, but this is definitely something where you can have your own style, your own approach to it, things. Okay, couple more nuts and bolts things about the submission process. Reviewers. And I see a question about journal. I'll get into that next. So I think there's kind of like a sweet spot maybe of reviewers, although this is a bit of speculation on my part, because I've certainly had things rejected from journals with this guidance. So take it as it is. But I think a good reviewer is going to be, they're going to have to get excited about the work. They're going to have to be like, oh, this is, you know, really cool what you've done. And so often that means they, you know, they're knowledgeable enough to see whatever the value is in it. So, you know, if it's a technique thing, they, you know, they need to appreciate technology in some respect and the technological contributions. But there's a balance there of if you have a reviewer who's really a direct competitor, who may be working on a, say in the technical example, maybe working on a similar technique or a competing technique, that can lead to, you know, harsh reviews potentially of where they're going to just really nitpick the work, or they may, you know, they have a personal interest in the area, and so they may let a little bit of that emotion get in the way of a more objective review. And so maybe there's a sweet spot of people who are still experts in the field, but they're not exactly working on the same, you know, aspect of these problems as you are. And you don't have, you know, you have a little bit of guidance you can provide editors, you can provide a list of recommended reviewers, and I would recommend making and accumulating a list from your collaborators. But the editors will often pick reviewers from the references too, so just keep that in mind. And then if you have the opportunity to review papers yourself and talk to your, if you don't get reviews, talk to your mentors about whether they can refer you to reviews or do reviews together. It's a really good way to improve your paper writing skills too. But if you see what happens on the other side, you can then adjust your writing to you know, help the reviewing process too. So journal question. So I'll say usually, do I have a journal in mind as I start writing? Yes, usually I think that's usually a good idea, because in some situations there's a few journals that might have the same audience, but sometimes they're just a little bit different, the audience and the expectations of the journal. So you want to have, you know, you have it narrowed down pretty good, and then you're also thinking about word count, you know, the sort of guide for authors stuff at the bottom there. What are the, you know, what are the constraints on the paper? The reason I'm going to choose a specific journal, first is really the readership. Like, is this, if I put it in this journal, will it reach the right people, you know, people browsing? So it's usually, for a lot of work that I do, I'm involved with, it's like MRM, you know, because it brings a lot of the community that, you know, MRI technique development together. And I would argue consider prestige, impact factor, basically secondary to that. I don't think that's the way everybody approaches this process. And arguably, you know, with maybe there's less emphasis now on specific journals since everything's just going through search anyway, but you have to be aware that often the higher impact journals are going to require more work. And also the editors tend to have more of a say in the process, as they determine, they'll make a harsher cutoff in terms of what actually gets reviewed. And the last point, you know, there are, if you are, you know, there's some animosity towards Elsevier for their practices, and some journals are better than others about supporting sort of or demanding support for open science and things. And as you can talk to your, if you have review experience, you can also gauge, well, is this a journal that sort of the editors are, we think have a good process, and are sort of giving every paper a fair review. I would consider that too. And for example, having reviewed a lot of times for MRM, I really see that the editors really care a lot about the papers that get published there, and they are very thoughtful about the review process. So another reason why I really like that journal. Let's see, do I write with the reviewers in mind or the general audience that reviewed the paper eventually? I try to write with the general audience in mind, but yeah, because if a good reviewer is probably more knowledgeable than the average general audience reader about the field, but the good reviewer should also understand that the paper needs to take a needs to write things towards the general audience, or at least appreciate that. And maybe one thing I'll do to kind of write a little bit to the reviewers is in how I choose the references that I'm going to incorporate, of trying to acknowledge people that are in the similar area who very likely could end up as reviewers. So I don't want to leave out sort of key reviewers' work if I can manage. So speaking of reviewers, the review process, I don't like reading reviews. I will say I will get reviews. I will leave them unread in my inbox, but I don't like reading those. But I think what I try to do is I try to at least sort of skim through the reviews once, and often I need to just take a break from it after that. I'll sort of look at it, but it can be a little more emotional, I think. Feels like sometimes very personal, the reviews. So usually for myself, I give it a little bit of time, and then I'll go back and read the reviews again, and I feel like I'm a little more rational and a little more objective at that point. And then I'll start putting all the reviewer comments in the response document first thing off the bat, and then just start picking them off, pick off maybe the easy ones to get the ball rolling, get my confidence up, and then maybe start addressing the harder problems and harder review questions. And I would strongly, don't feel like you have to do this alone. It can be very easy and very common to misunderstand what the reviewers want, whether it's, the review was written a little too fast, or, just the confusion. Because often you may address a review concern that you may be addressing the wrong concern. And I'll say I see that is very common. So this is where having a sanity check on your co-authors, especially if any parts that you're confused, just be like, hey, what do you think they mean? Is it appropriate to do this change to do this? And then maybe this is obvious, but it's you do not actually have to respond and fix each comment. If you feel strongly that the comment is not valid or not appropriate, you just have to be prepared to have a clear and defendable response to that comment if you think that is appropriate, and be prepared for be prepared then for a little bit more of a back and forth potentially in the review process. But I think you can, I think that's certainly valid. And if you think the reviewer is being unreasonable, and sometimes they are, sometimes they did miss something, that's also quite common. Valentina, as a reviewer, I usually decide the sort of my review pretty soon in my reading process. Am I a bad person? Well, no. I think a lot of reviewers, yeah, will kind of make a decision about how the review is going to go, whether it's going to be a reject or some sort of on acceptance track pretty early on in reading the paper. But part of that is as a reviewer, you're somebody who should be very knowledgeable about the field. You should be able to almost read the title and be like, okay, here's our field. This person is working in little space here. Not that it's little, but a space right here, unique space here. And you can really figure out the context. You can kind of quickly assess, and you have to know like what the action is in the whole field. So you can pretty quickly assess, is this going to fit well into the scientific literature in this journal. So I think it's more a result of that. Yeah, your reviewers may decide relatively quickly whether they are going to accept or reject your paper. And so having, the clear title, the clear abstract, and a strong set of figures that hopefully they look at kind of quickly will, or kind of soon in the process will, hopefully get them on the right, get them on board with what you're trying to say and that it's significant. Okay, we've gone a bit over here. Here's my most important rule. For those of you who are as old as me, or get the reference here. The most important rule, this is from the paper, and I think this is great. The most important rule is ignore any and all other rules if doing so makes the paper easier to read. Writing the clearest, easiest to read papers as possible is the one and only goal. There's no single right way to do this that fits all stories under all circumstances. And remember, writing is an experimental science. Just keep experimenting until you find a way that works for the task at hand. Good luck. So, I like that last point of it's an experimental science. And so go into that with that expectation is that you're gonna, some experiment is gonna fail. But for every failed experiment, you're going to know how to change things in the next experiment, and you have your co-authors there to support you and know that we have all failed at writing. We have all failed at publishing. Those of us who have been in this field or this area long enough. You just but you have to do it. It's really an important part of the scientific process. Okay, 5:21. I'm going to wrap up there, and thank you very much, everyone, for attending. If there are any questions that I didn't answer during the talk, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes here and talk about those. But, yeah, thanks for everyone for joining. Great.